More than half a century ago, a promise was written into the conscience of a nation, a promise that all people are created equal and entitled to justice, dignity, and opportunity. Yet today, that promise remains unfinished. The dream was spoken aloud, but the work of fulfilling it was left in our hands. We gather not to question the promise of equality, but to ask why it is still delayed, denied, and deferred for so many. The idea that equality delayed is equality denied captures a painful truth about justice and human dignity. When people are told to wait for their rights, they are not merely being asked for patience. They are being asked to continue living under unfair conditions that limit their opportunities, silence their voices, and weaken their sense of worth. Equality that exists only as a future promise fails to protect those who suffer discrimination in the present. Time does not heal injustice on its own, and progress that moves too slowly often serves the comfort of the powerful rather than the needs of the oppressed. Delays in equality affect every part of life, from education and employment to housing and political representation. When certain groups are denied equal access to quality schools, they fall behind through no fault of their own. When fair employment opportunities are postponed, families remain trapped in cycles of poverty. These delays compound over generations, turning temporary injustice into permanent disadvantage. The cost of waiting is not abstract. It is measured in lost potential, broken dreams, and lives shaped by barriers that should never have existed. Telling marginalized communities to wait also sends a harmful message that their suffering is less urgent or less important. It implies that stability and order matter more than justice and fairness. Throughout history, demands for equality have often been met with calls for gradual change. Yet gradualism has frequently been used as a tool to preserve inequality. Those who benefit from unjust systems rarely feel the pressure of delay, while those harmed by them experience its consequences every day. Equality delayed also weakens trust in institutions and democratic ideals. When laws promise equal rights but fail to deliver them in practice, people begin to question whether justice truly applies to everyone. This gap between principle and reality creates frustration, anger, and disillusionment, making social harmony harder to achieve. A society that postpones equality risks deepening divisions and reinforcing resentment, rather than fostering unity and mutual respect. True equality requires immediate and deliberate action. Justice must be responsive to present suffering, not endlessly postponed in the name of caution or tradition. Rights lose their meaning when they are treated as optional or negotiable, and dignity cannot survive on promises alone. Equality must be lived, enforced, and protected in real time, because every moment of delay allows injustice to continue shaping lives, limiting freedom, and denying people the full humanity they deserve. Systemic injustice refers to unfair structures and practices embedded within social, economic, and political institutions that consistently disadvantage certain groups while benefiting others. Unlike individual acts of discrimination, systemic injustice operates quietly and persistently, shaping outcomes long before personal choices come into play. Laws, policies, and institutional norms that appear neutral on the surface often produce unequal results, reinforcing patterns of inequality that pass from one generation to the next. In education, systemic injustice can be seen in unequal school funding, overcrowded classrooms, and limited access to learning resources. Children born into marginalized communities often attend under-resourced schools, not because of a lack of ability or effort, but because of policies that tie educational quality to neighborhood wealth. These early disadvantages restrict academic achievement and reduce future opportunities, creating a cycle in which inequality reproduces itself. Economic systems also reflect deep structural imbalances. Hiring practices, wage gaps, and barriers to advancement often favor those already in positions of privilege. Even when discrimination is not overt, networks of opportunity, inherited wealth, and social connections shape who succeeds and who struggles. As a result, many individuals work harder yet receive less, while structural advantages protect others from the consequences of failure. Systemic injustice is also evident in housing and healthcare. Discriminatory housing policies have historically confined certain communities to areas with fewer services, environmental hazards, and limited economic growth. Access to quality health care often depends on income, location, and insurance status, leaving vulnerable populations exposed to preventable illness and shorter life expectancy. These conditions are not accidents but outcomes of long-standing institutional decisions. The justice system further illustrates how deeply embedded inequality can be. Disparities in policing, sentencing, and incarceration rates reveal patterns that cannot be explained solely by individual behavior. When entire communities experience disproportionate surveillance and punishment, trust in legal institutions erodes, and social inequality deepens. Systemic injustice shapes lives by influencing where people live, how they are educated, the work they can obtain, and the treatment they receive from public institutions. It limits potential long before individuals are able to assert their talents or ambitions, ensuring that inequality remains stable and self-perpetuating. Addressing systemic injustice requires recognizing that inequality is not simply the result of personal failure, but the consequence of structures that distribute power, resources, and opportunity unevenly across society. Systemic injustice describes the ways in which inequality is built into the foundations of society, influencing outcomes regardless of individual intent or effort. It exists within laws, institutions, and social norms that consistently advantage some groups while limiting others. Because these systems operate over long periods of time, they shape lives quietly and powerfully, often appearing normal or unavoidable even when they produce deeply unequal results. From birth, systemic injustice affects access to opportunity. The neighborhood a person is born into can determine the quality of schools, availability of health care, exposure to violence, and access to nutritious food. These conditions are not random, but are the result of historical decisions about housing, zoning, and public investment. When entire communities are denied resources for decades, inequality becomes entrenched and difficult to escape. Education is one of the clearest examples of systemic injustice. Schools in wealthier areas receive more funding, better facilities, and greater academic support, while schools in marginalized communities struggle with overcrowding and limited materials. Students facing these conditions are often blamed for lower performance, even though the system itself has placed them at a disadvantage. This unequal foundation shapes future employment opportunities and earning potential. Economic systems also reflect structural inequality. Hiring practices may favor certain backgrounds, names, or social networks, while wage gaps persist across race and gender lines. Access to capital, credit, and business opportunities often depends on inherited wealth or institutional trust, both of which have historically excluded marginalized groups. Hard work alone cannot overcome barriers that are built into the system. Healthcare and environmental conditions further demonstrate how systemic injustice shapes lives. Marginalized communities are more likely to live near pollution, lack access to quality medical care, and experience higher rates of chronic illness. These outcomes are tied to policy decisions, not personal choices. When health and life expectancy are shaped by structural inequality, injustice becomes a matter of survival. The justice system reveals how deeply systemic injustice is embedded. Disparities in policing, sentencing, and incarceration reflect patterns that extend beyond individual actions. When laws are enforced unevenly, trust erodes and inequality deepens. Systemic injustice continues to shape lives by controlling access to safety, opportunity, and dignity, ensuring that inequality remains persistent unless the structures themselves are challenged and transformed. Economic inequality weakens the very foundation of freedom by limiting people's ability to make meaningful choices about their lives. Freedom is not only the absence of oppression, but the presence of real opportunities. When wealth and resources are concentrated in the hands of a few, millions are left without access to education, health care, stable housing, or fair employment. In such conditions, freedom becomes a privilege rather than a universal right. Those living in economic hardship often face choices that are shaped by necessity rather than desire. A person struggling to afford food or rent cannot freely choose their career, pursue education, or participate fully in civic life. Economic insecurity forces individuals to accept unsafe working conditions, unfair wages, and exploitative practices simply to survive. This lack of economic power restricts personal agency and reduces freedom to a theoretical concept rather than a lived experience. Economic inequality also affects political freedom. Wealth influences access to political power, amplifying the voices of the rich while marginalizing those with fewer resources. When money shapes elections, policies, and public discourse, democratic ideals are weakened. Individuals without financial influence may find their concerns ignored, creating a system where political participation exists in form but not in substance. The impact of economic inequality extends across generations. Families with wealth can invest in quality education, health care, and opportunities that secure long-term stability. Families without resources often remain trapped in cycles of poverty, not because of a lack of effort, but because the system offers unequal starting points. This intergenerational inequality limits social mobility and restricts freedom long before individuals are able to shape their own futures. Economic inequality also undermines social freedom by fostering division and resentment. Large gaps between rich and poor weaken social trust and reduce the sense of shared responsibility within a society. When people believe the system is unfairly stacked against them, social cohesion erodes, making cooperation and mutual respect more difficult to sustain. True freedom requires more than legal rights. It depends on fair access to resources and opportunities. Without economic justice, freedom remains incomplete, accessible only to those who can afford it. A society that tolerates extreme economic inequality limits the potential of its people and weakens the promise of freedom for all. Silence becomes a powerful force against justice when it allows wrongdoing to continue without challenge. In the face of injustice, choosing not to speak is rarely a neutral act. Silence often protects those who benefit from unfair systems while leaving the oppressed without support or recognition. When voices that could challenge inequality remain quiet, injustice gains space to grow and normalize itself within society. Throughout history, progress toward justice has depended on individuals and communities who were willing to speak out, even when doing so carried personal risk. Silence, on the other hand, has repeatedly delayed reform and allowed harmful practices to persist. When people witness discrimination, abuse, or inequality and choose comfort over courage, they indirectly participate in maintaining injustice. Silence sends a message that the suffering of others is acceptable or unworthy of attention. Silence also weakens accountability. Institutions and individuals are less likely to change when they are not questioned or criticized. Without public pressure, unjust policies and practices can continue unchecked, hidden behind bureaucracy or tradition. Speaking out exposes injustice, forces reflection, and creates the possibility of reform. Without voices demanding change, power remains unchallenged and unbalanced. For those who experience injustice, silence from others can be deeply damaging. It creates a sense of isolation and invisibility, reinforcing the belief that their pain does not matter. When society fails to acknowledge suffering, it denies people their dignity and humanity. Silence can feel like abandonment, making injustice not only structural, but also emotional and psychological. Silence also distorts moral responsibility. People often justify inaction by claiming neutrality, yet neutrality in situations of injustice often favors the status quo. When laws or systems harm certain groups, refusing to take a stand effectively sides with those who hold power. Justice requires active engagement, not passive observation. Breaking silence is essential for building a just society. Speaking out raises awareness, challenges false narratives, and encourages collective responsibility. Even small acts of courage can inspire broader movements for change. Justice depends on voices that refuse to accept inequality as normal and suffering as inevitable. When silence dominates, injustice thrives, shaping societies where fairness is postponed and accountability is avoided. Unity represents the collective strength that emerges when people recognize their shared humanity, despite differences in background, belief, or experience. Division, by contrast, weakens societies by isolating groups and encouraging fear, mistrust, and hostility. When people are divided, they are easier to ignore, manipulate, or silence. Unity brings voices together, amplifying demands for justice, dignity, and equal opportunity in ways that isolated individuals or groups cannot achieve alone. Division often grows from misunderstandings, stereotypes, and unequal access to power. When societies emphasize differences without acknowledging shared goals, they create artificial barriers that prevent cooperation. These divisions are frequently exploited to maintain existing hierarchies, turning communities against one another rather than addressing the systems that produce inequality. In such environments, energy that could be used to create positive change is instead spent on conflict and resentment. Unity does not require sameness. It allows for diversity of culture, opinion, and identity while emphasizing mutual respect and common purpose. A unified society understands that the success of one group does not come at the expense of another. Instead, progress is shared, and justice for one strengthens justice for all. When people work together across lines of difference, they challenge the false idea that equality is a limited resource. Social movements throughout history have demonstrated the power of unity. Change has occurred most effectively when individuals from different communities join together to demand fairness and accountability. Unity creates resilience, enabling societies to confront challenges such as inequality, discrimination, and economic hardship with collective resolve rather than fragmented efforts. Division also damages democratic values. When people see one another as enemies rather than neighbors, trust erodes and cooperation becomes difficult. Public discourse turns hostile, and compromise is viewed as weakness rather than a necessary part of collective decision-making. This breakdown in social cohesion undermines stability and weakens the institutions meant to serve everyone. Unity strengthens societies by fostering empathy and shared responsibility. It encourages people to listen, learn, and act together rather than retreat into isolated perspectives. When unity replaces division, societies become better equipped to confront injustice and build systems that reflect fairness and inclusion. Strength grows when people stand together, recognizing that lasting progress depends on cooperation, solidarity, and a shared commitment to the common good. The responsibility of the present generation lies in recognizing that progress is never automatic and justice is never self-sustaining. Every generation inherits the outcomes of past decisions, including both advances and failures. While history may explain existing inequalities and injustices, it cannot excuse inaction in the present. Those living today hold the power to either challenge unfair systems or allow them to continue shaping the future. The present generation benefits from sacrifices made by those who came before, from hard-won rights to social and technological advancements. These gains were not inevitable. They were achieved through struggle, courage, and collective action. With these benefits comes an obligation to protect and expand them. Ignoring injustice today risks undoing past progress and passing unresolved problems to future generations. Responsibility also means awareness. In an age of widespread information and global connection, ignorance is no longer a valid defense. The present generation has access to knowledge about inequality, climate challenges, economic injustice, and human rights violations across the world. Awareness creates moral accountability. Knowing that harm exists and choosing not to act allows injustice to persist through complacency rather than force. The choices made today shape the conditions of tomorrow. Policies enacted, resources distributed, and values promoted in the present will define the opportunities available to future generations. When leaders and citizens prioritize short-term comfort over long-term justice, they leave behind deeper divisions and more complex challenges. Responsibility requires thinking beyond immediate benefit and considering lasting impact. The present generation also holds responsibility in everyday actions, not just large-scale decisions. Speaking out against discrimination, supporting fair practices, and fostering understanding within communities all contribute to social change. Responsibility is shared, not limited to those in positions of power. Collective behavior gradually reshapes cultural norms and institutional priorities. Passing responsibility to the future is itself a choice, one that delays solutions and increases harm. Each generation faces a moment when it must decide whether to act or remain passive. The present generation stands at such a moment with the ability to confront injustice, protect dignity, and strengthen equality. What is done now will determine whether future generations inherit unresolved struggles or a more just and inclusive world. The promise of equality has never been a gift freely given. It has always been a responsibility carried forward. The work left unfinished calls not for remembrance alone, but for action, courage, and unity. Justice cannot survive in silence. Freedom cannot exist without fairness. And progress cannot move forward while division pulls us apart. The future will not judge us by the words we repeat, but by the choices we make and the stand we take. The promise remains before us, waiting not for time to pass, but for us to rise and fulfill it.